All right, this time around we'll be talking about the circulatory pathway. Since we have already understood the flow of blood in the heart, we'll be able to better understand also the pathway of blood to the rest of the body and then back to the heart again. So if you're ready, let's start. So first, we have to know that there are two types of circulation present in the body. The first is pulmonary circulation, and it's also called as the pulmonary loop. Basically, the pulmonary circulation is the blood flow from the heart going to the lungs and back. So usually it starts from the right ventricle and it travels or opens up the pulmonary semilunar valve to enter the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary arteries, and then it goes to the lungs for blood to be oxygenated. And then it goes back to the heart via the pulmonary veins and it goes to the left atrium where heart is again received since the atrium is the receiving chamber of the heart. The second type of circulation is systemic circulation, also known as the systemic loop, and basically this is how blood flows to the rest of the body from the left ventricle. So from the left ventricle, it will force open the aortic semilunar valve. It will then go to the aorta, and then it goes to the different types of arteries to be distributed to the rest of the body. So there are three types of blood vessels which makes up the entire circulatory pathway. The first are the arteries, and as mentioned earlier, in order for us to better remember it, arteries send blood away. So letter A, arteries away from the heart. And usually the type of blood that they carry are oxygenated blood, thus they always have these reddish colors in diagrams. There are smaller versions of arteries called arterioles, and usually arterioles are the smaller versions before they become part of the capillaries. On the other hand, veins carry the oxygenated blood from the tissues or organs and it brings them back to the heart. Okay, so veins brings back blood to the heart. That's how I memorize it in order for you not to interchange your arteries and your veins. The smaller versions are called venules, and from the capillaries, they first become venules before they become into the larger veins as we know them. And lastly, the capillaries, which is a small network of vessels where air exchange happens. So basically, blood from the arteries carrying oxygen will go to the capillaries. Oxygen will be released in those areas and carbon dioxide will be absorbed, and then other waste products will also be absorbed, and then it will go to the veins and then be brought back to the heart in order for it to be oxygenated in the lungs. For the arteries, it all begins with the aorta. Okay, so the aorta is the largest artery and it originates from the left ventricle. Okay, so there are different divisions to the aorta, and the first one is the ascending aorta. Ascending because from the left ventricle it goes upwards or superiorly, and thus the name ascending aorta. So it is also from the ascending aorta where the coronary arteries branch off. Again, the coronary arteries are the blood vessels which supply blood and oxygen to the myocardium. And the coronary arteries are the vessels which are responsible for heart attack. So when they become clogged or when they become blocked off, a heart attack ensues. Next part is the aortic arch, this perpendicular area here. And this is where the aorta bends to become the descending aorta. The descending aorta is the rest of the aorta, the remainder of the aorta. But once it enters the thoracic area, it will then be called the thoracic aorta. And once it enters the abdomen, it will then be called the abdominal aorta. Now, let's talk about the arteries found in the head and neck. And let's all first start with the branches of the aortic arch. So, if you see in this image above, the aortic arch will have one, two, and three main branches. The first main branch is called the brachiocephalic artery. It's important for us to understand that from the brachiocephalic artery, it will have two branches, mainly the right common carotid and the right subclavian. So the right common carotid is the medial branch of the brachiocephalic artery, while the right subclavian is the lateral branch of the brachiocephalic artery. On the other hand, the left common carotid and the left subclavian artery are direct branches of the aortic arch. They need not come from a brachiocephalic artery. So that's what sets them apart. Okay? The left common carotid artery is the second branch of the aortic arch, while the left subclavian artery is the third and final branch of the aortic arch. So it's only for the right where it first branches into the brachiocephalic before dividing into the right common and right subclavian artery. For the right and left common carotid arteries, they will further divide into the internal and external carotid arteries. The external carotid artery will supply the external part of the head, while the internal carotid artery will enter the brain to become the circle of Willis. So this circular network of arteries here are supplies the brain with blood and oxygen, and that is what we call the circle of Willis. Now, for the upper limb of the body, it all begins with the subclavian artery. So for the right side, the subclavian artery will come from the brachiocephalic, while for the left side, the subclavian artery will directly come from the aortic arch. So once the subclavian artery goes inferior to the clavicle, it will then be called the axillary artery, which will supply blood to the axillary area. Once it reaches the upper arm, it will then be called the brachial artery. So the brachial artery comes from the axillary artery, and the axillary artery comes from the subclavian artery. The brachial will then divide into two, the ulnar artery and the radial artery. So the ulnar artery is the median branch of the brachial artery, while the radial artery is the lateral or external branch of the brachial artery. For the thorax or the thoracic aorta, there are only two main branches. First is the intercostal arteries. You're able to see them here. The intercostal arteries provide blood to the intercostal muscles. So if you will observe the flow of the intercostal arteries, they are underneath the ribs, no, in order to provide blood to the muscles in between. While the second one is the phrenic artery here, and they are lay on top of the diaphragm because the phrenic arteries provide blood exactly to the diaphragm. The abdominal aorta, on the other hand, has many branches. The first branch of the abdominal aorta is the celiac artery, which provides blood. Here's a celiac trunk. The celiac artery provides blood to the stomach, the pancreas, and the liver. The next main branch of the abdominal aorta is the superior mesenteric artery, which supplies blood to the small intestines and the proximal large intestines. The third branch is the inferior mesenteric artery, which supplies blood to the distal parts of the large intestine. The fourth one is the renal artery. As you can see here, it supplies blood to the kidneys. The fifth one are the thinner arteries on top, when we call them suprarenal, and they supply blood to the adrenal glands, since the adrenal glands are above or superior to your renal tissues or to your kidneys. You also have your gonadal arteries, these two long branches here at the sides, and they become your testicular if you're a male or ovarian if you're a female. You become your testicular and ovarian arteries. And lastly, we have your common iliac. which is the division or the branching out of your abdominal aorta into two. So here we have the right common iliac, and here we have the left common iliac. And those two main vessels go to the lower extremities, which brings us to the lower extremity. So the common iliac artery divides into two. The first is the internal iliac, which is the medial branch of the common iliac and provides blood to the pelvic organs, while the external iliac is the lateral branch of the common iliac. And the external iliac is the one that goes down to the lower limb. Once the external iliac reaches the thigh, it changes its name and becomes the femoral artery. And it supplies the different muscles found in those areas. Eventually, as it goes down, it will go to the posterior side and become the popliteal artery and supply the posterior knee. Afterwards, as it travels down, it will become the anterior and posterior tibial artery to provide blood to the shin areas both anteriorly and posteriorly. As for the veins, we know that veins bring back blood back to the heart. Now, this can be a little bit confusing because the flow of blood for veins is from the tissues and organs back to the vena cavas, the superior and inferior vena cavas, and then to the heart. So the blood flow is from distal to proximal, all right? And it all begins with what supplies the superior vena cava. And the main supply of the superior vena cava is the brachiocephalic vein. So we are now talking about veins, okay? So all blood gathered by the brachiocephalic vein will be brought into the superior vena cava. Again, the superior vena cava receives blood from the upper half of the body. Next, we have the subclavian vein. And the subclavian vein and the internal jugular vein both drains into the brachiocephalic. Okay? So, for the arteries, the brachiocephalic branches out into the right common carotid and the right subclavian. But for the veins, there is no more carotid. It becomes subclavian and internal jugular. Okay? So, both the subclavian and the internal jugular vein will supply blood to the brachiocephalic and then brachiocephalic to the superior vena cava. Next is your external jugular, and the blood gathered by the external jugular will be brought into the subclavian. Okay? So, external jugular to the subclavian, subclavian to the brachiocephalic, and then brachiocephalic to the superior vena cava. For the upper extremity, somehow similar. So, we have the axillary vein, and the axillary vein brings back blood to the subclavian as well. The brachial veins will supply blood to the axillary vein, while the cephalic vein, the ones in the forearm, will supply blood directly to the subclavian. So the subclavian receives blood from three areas. What are those three areas? External jugular, axillary, and cephalic. Remember that. The subclavian, or a vein, receives blood from three areas. Your external jugular, your axillary, and your cephalic. Your brachial vein will supply blood to the axillary. And eventually, everything goes to the subclavian. Subclavian to the brachiocephalic. Brachiocephalic to the superior vena cava. For the thoracic veins, first we have the azygos. And the azygos veins are only found on the left side of the body. So it is an unpaired branch or an unpaired vein which directly drains into the superior vena cava. So now the superior vena cava receives blood from two areas, brachiocephalic and azygos. Okay? So the hemiazygous are a set of veins that eventually empty their collected deoxygenated blood to the azygos as well. So hemiazygous to azygous. And then the intercostal veins, if they are found on the left, will drain their blood to the azygos, and if they are found to the right, will drain their blood to the hemiazygous. And then hemiazygous to azygous, azygous to superior vena cava. For the abdominal vein, of course, now that we are in the lower half of the body, they will drain their blood to the inferior vena cava. So blood coming from the liver will be going to the hepatic vein, and then will go to here's the hepatic vein, and then we'll go to the inferior vena cava here, this big vessel here. And then blood from the kidneys will go to the renal vein, and the renal vein will go to the inferior vena cava. Gonadal arteries also, gonadal veins from the gonads, whether it be testicle or ovary, will be drained into the gonadal vein and will enter the inferior vena cava. And then eventually, we have the common iliac. So the common iliac receives blood from the lower extremity and brings it back to the inferior vena cava together with your internal iliac, which drains blood from the pelvic area. So pelvic area to the internal iliac to the common iliac. Okay? So for the lower limb, we have the external iliac vein, which receives all the blood from the lower extremity going towards the common iliac. Okay, so the external iliac is the one that receives all blood from the lower extremity before it goes to the common iliac. So the femoral vein goes to the external iliac. The great saphenous vein, which is found medially, also goes to the external iliac. The popliteal vein goes naman to the femoral vein. And all the other saphenouses, small saphenous veins, goes naman to the femoral. Okay? Now, for the abdominal organs, they have a special way of draining their blood from the abdominal organs, okay? So we know that after eating, we're able to digest our carbohydrates, our proteins, our fats. We're able to absorb our nutrients, our vitamins. But before it goes to the heart to be distributed to the rest of the body, it first has to go to the liver. That's why this is called portal circulation. What happens in the liver? Why do we have to bring all abdominal blood to the liver first? For detoxification. Okay? So it is a set of vessels that begins and ends with the capillary networks. And the hepatic portal system transports blood from the digestive organs to the liver before sending it back to the heart via the inferior vena cava. So the hepatic portal vein is the one that collects all this blood from the abdominal organs. The superior mesenteric gathers blood from the small intestine going towards the hepatic portal vein. Same with the inferior mesenteric, which gathers blood from your large intestine. Your splenic vein, which gathers blood from the spleen. The gastroepiploic vein, which gathers blood from the stomach. And that's it. Lastly, for fetal circulation, this is quite confusing if you will not listen properly. But in order for us to better understand it, I want you to join me in the discussion. So we know that in fetuses or in babies inside the mother's womb, their lungs do not function yet. Their lungs cannot expand. Their lungs do not have air. So oxygenation of their blood will come mainly from the mother. And oxygenated blood, or the exchange of oxygen, happens in a structure called placenta. Here, the placenta. So once fetal blood has been oxygenated, it will be brought back to the heart. And what brings back blood to the heart again? A vein. So that vein is called the umbilical vein here. The umbilical vein. Now this is quite unique because we know that veins generally carry the oxygenated blood, right? But here we have a vein that carries oxygenated blood. Previously, we have only discussed one vein that carries oxygenated blood, and that is your pulmonary vein. Now we have two. Two veins that carry oxygenated blood. Your pulmonary vein and your umbilical vein. So, once oxygenated blood is carried by the umbilical vein, it will go through the liver first. And once it goes to the liver, it changes its name. From umbilical vein, it becomes called ductus venosus. Okay? It's called ductus venosus. So inside the liver, it changes its name to become your ductus venosus. And then eventually it will drain into the inferior vena cava, and blood will similarly enter the right atrium. Okay? Once inside the right atrium, there is a hole in between the atrial wall. So the wall that separates the right and the left atrium has a hole, and that hole is called foramen ovale. So the foramen ovale is a hole in the atrial wall from the right atrium to the left atrium in order to bypass the pulmonary circulation. Since there is no pulmonary circulation for babies, blood is transported directly to the left side of the heart via the foramen ovale. Okay? Now, some of those blood will still enter the right atrium and then to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, some of those blood will then enter the pulmonary trunk. But since there is no lungs to go to, there is no oxygen in the lungs, blood from the pulmonary trunk will be brought to the aorta via a bridge called ductus arteriosus. Again, blood from the right atrium, the oxygenated blood from the right atrium, will mix with the oxygenated blood from the inferior vena cava. Kaya siya color blue. Kasi nagmix na ulit. When it goes to the right atrium, it becomes purple, meaning mixture of your oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. It will then be pushed to the pulmonary trunk. But since the lungs are not yet working, it will have a bridge towards the aorta. You see this bridge here? That's the bridge towards the aorta, and we call that the ductus arteriosus. Therefore, blood flowing through the descending aorta is partially deoxygenated because it has already been mixed with the oxygenated blood from the right atrium. So the oxygenated blood will be the one that is distributed to the rest of the body and will go back to the placenta to be oxygenated via the umbilical arteries away from the heart. Umbilical arteries. Hopefully that's clear. And here is a summary in order for us to better understand the flow I just mentioned. All right, if there's no more questions, then please do answer pages 377, 378, and 379. Deadline is Sunday, 10 p.m. Thank you, guys.